Died for you. Jesus died for you. You might have heard it quite a few times. It's the foundation of our faith, really, as Christians, isn't it? It's something really, really important and fundamental. But for many of us, if we've been coming to church for a while, it might be something that we've heard quite a lot of times. And it could be something that you might take for granted. You might think, yeah, of course he did. I've heard that loads of times. It's good. Yeah, sure. But yeah, I think my hope this evening is just to kind of dig into that reality a little bit more and just to ask God to kind of help us to recapture the wonder of the cross, to help us to recapture the wonder of what he's done for us through his death and resurrection. So we're going to think particularly about this. I've given this talk the title, Love is an Opened Door. If you're fans of Frozen, it's a slight play on a title of a Frozen song. And I'll explain later why I've changed it from an open door to an open door. Why don't we start in the Bible? If you've got a Bible with you, we're going to start in Revelation chapter 3, verses 7 to 8. It should come up on the screen as well, but you might like to have it in front of you if you're keen, if you have a Bible or a phone with you. Revelation 3, from verse 7, is a series of 7 letters written to 7 churches. And you may know that one of them is written to a church in Philadelphia. It's not this Philadelphia, sadly, although it kind of is because they're in the Bible and therefore they're written to all Christians everywhere for all time. It's originally written to a Philadelphia in Turkey. And Mike said to me ages ago, this letter was kind of significant when this church was planted. God was kind of speaking through this letter. And so these are some verses that as Liz and I were kind of praying about whether to come to this church, we were reflecting on them then. And since we've arrived, I've been reflecting on them a little bit more. So let's read them together and see what it says. Revelation 3 from verse 7. To the angel of the church in Philadelphia, write. These are the words of him who is holy and true, who holds the key of David. What he opens, no one can shut, and what he shuts, no one can open. I know your deeds. See, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut. I know that you have little strength, yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. And so the first time recently that I was particularly reflecting on this verse was when I was kind of praying about whether this was the church God was calling us to come to, for me to be the curate. And the thing that really stuck out was I literally went to this passage in that moment of, God, is this the right thing? And that was the phrase that stood out to me. Jesus has opened a door for me that no one can shut. I've set before you an open door that no one can shut. And that just seemed to me like God was confirming that this was where he was calling us. And that was a really wonderful moment for me and for us, just to sense God speaking to us and guiding us. But as I've reflected on this passage more recently, since coming and starting to be part of the church and get to know people and get a sense of what God's doing, I was praying about it again, and I felt God emphasize something a bit different about this passage. And the thing that I kind of felt God saying was that the open door that Jesus has opened, which no one can shut, is really the way into his presence. It's the way into intimacy with God. It's the way to be close with God. And I really felt that was kind of a word for, maybe for me, but maybe for us a bit more widely as well. It kind of links in with our vision this term. We want to be a church that's going deeper into the presence of God. We want to be a church that is starting this evening service specifically to make space for that and to make it a priority across everything that we do as a church, as Mike was reminding us at the start. And so I just thought, yeah, this verse actually kind of makes sense. God's opened a door for us to come into his presence. That door can't be shut, and we're called to walk through it. We're called to be Christians who love being in the presence of the Father through Jesus. And I did a little bit of kind of reading. I was trying to get to the bottom of what, people who are cleverer than me and have studied the Bible more than me think that phrase is actually about. Is it an opportunity? Is the open door an opportunity for the church in Philadelphia, or is it God's presence? And people have different ideas, but there are some clever people who have decided that it probably is, or was originally intended by John to be a door into God's presence. And to kind of understand why, we're just going to dig a little bit deeper into this passage. You'll notice that at the start of it, it says, "These are the words of him who is holy and true, the one who holds the key of David." And in case you're not sure, this is talking about Jesus. Jesus is the one who's holy and true, and Jesus is the one who holds the key of David. But there's someone else in our Bible who is also described using that same phrase. I didn't know this. I read this in a book, so I'm not like super nerdy. But in Isaiah 22, in the Old Testament, I am a bit nerdy, but you know, sometimes other people are even nerdier. In Isaiah 22, there's someone else who's described in the same way, who's described as someone who holds the key of David. His name is Eliakim. You can look it up if you want to in Isaiah 22. It's about verse 22, or you can take my word for it. His name's Eliakim, and Eliakim has this important job for King Hezekiah, who's the king at the time. And his job is to be the steward of the king. And if you wanted to go and spend time with the king, if you wanted an audience with the king, if you wanted to speak to him or go and hang out with him or whatever you wanted to do with the king, you had to go through Eliakim. Eliakim was the one who held the key of David. David was the king of Israel and kind of represents the whole kingship thing in the Old Testament. So if you wanted to see the king, you had to see the guy who had the key of David, and he was Eliakim. And I think the reason why this is helpful for us in reading the Revelation passage is because John's reminding the people reading the letter, and those people might have been a bit more familiar with the Old Testament than maybe some of us are, certainly than I am. I didn't jump to this conclusion when I read this passage. But they might have realized, oh, Jesus is a bit like Eliakim. Just as this guy had the authority to let people into the presence of the king, so Jesus has the authority to open the door for people to come into the presence of the Father. And I noticed something else looking at this passage as well, which isn't always brought out in some translations, but the door that Jesus has opened that no one can shut, it's an opened door. Not just an open door, but an opened door, which might sound insignificant, but I guess it reminds us that that door was once closed. And we're going to think about why there might have been a closed door between us and God and what Jesus has done to open it. And the way that he opens it, of course, is through the cross. And so that's what we're going to think about next, how Jesus at the cross has opened the door for us to come into God's presence. I wonder if anyone asked you, I'm not sure what kind of situation this would happen in, but if anyone asked you, oh, could you please just quickly create a logo for Christianity? If someone said that to you, what would you come up with? There could be lots of different options. I've come up with a few off the top of my head, which I've got some pictures of on the screen. A logo for Christianity. You could go for a manger. Reminds us of Jesus becoming a person, him being a helpless baby, even though he's the Lord of heaven. Really good thing, great thing. Good for Christmas, but maybe good all round. You could go for Jesus' face. Not that we necessarily know what that looked like, but, that came up on the internet, so presumably that's right. What about a dove? For the Holy Spirit, we're Christians who live in the age of the Holy Spirit that's been poured out. Why don't we have the dove as our symbol? That could be great. Or the empty tomb. The triumphant moment of Jesus' life on earth is his resurrection. Maybe we should have the empty tomb. There's so many others. You can probably think of other examples and things that we could have as the logo for our faith. But the thing that's prevailed, the symbol that's prevailed above them all is the cross, isn't it? That's the symbol that's become so synonymous with Christianity around the world. And you might find some Christians will have images of a cross with Jesus still on it, emphasizing his sacrifice and his death, and others will have an empty cross. We often have an empty cross, reminding us that Jesus isn't on the cross anymore. He's risen. Sorry if that's a bit of a spoiler alert for you. And so somehow this symbol, this instrument of death and torture from 2,000 years ago, has become a symbol of freedom and healing and life. And so how does Jesus do that? How does the cross make possible the kind of intimacy with God that we long to enjoy as Christians at this church and particularly in this service? How does Jesus' death do that? Well, why don't we have a look at Mark 15 from verse 33. This is the moment of Jesus' death. We were reading the same passage, but in Luke in our staff prayer time earlier this week. And it's really good sometimes to read like Christmas or Easter passages at other times of year, just to remind ourselves of some of the really important stuff. So we're just going to read from Mark 15 from verse 33. 33, sorry. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing near heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he asked. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. It's such a poignant moment in the Gospels, isn't it? It feels like something really significant is happening, especially when you read the kind of other details around what goes on. Darkness comes over the land. There's an earthquake. There's all kinds of stuff going on when Jesus died, as though the whole of creation recognizes the weight of this moment. And none of those details are recorded by the gospel writers without reason. You know, when they record random little details, often it's for a reason for us. And one of those details is in verse 38. And it's so, really helps us to understand what goes on at Jesus' death and what happens at the cross. Verse 38, the temple curtain was torn in two from top to bottom. And in the temple, the place of worship for the Jews, that curtain was the doorway into the presence of God. But it wasn't an open door. It wasn't somewhere you could just wander into willy-nilly. Only the high priest was allowed to go in there, and only then once a year to make atonement for the sins of the people. And so you might think, well, why was there a door? Why do we need a door between God and us? Why was there that door? And I thought we could just turn to Hebrews chapter 9. I'm not going to apologize for jumping around the Bible because it's all good stuff. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 11 to 15. Just tell us a little bit. Why is there a door? Why is there something that comes between us and God? Why couldn't we just wander into his presence freely? And we read this, Christ has now become the high priest over all the good things that have come. And then just continuing in verse 14. Christ offered himself to God as a perfect sacrifice for our sins. That is why he is the one who mediates a new covenant between God and people, so that all who are called can receive the eternal inheritance God has promised them. For Christ died to set them free from the penalty of the sins they had committed under that first covenant. I don't know how you think about sin. I'm always kind of conscious that I don't want to be the kind of preacher who talks about sin all the time. You've ever met Christians who are a bit like that? We can focus too much on it. We can make the whole gospel about sin, and sometimes that can be a bit too unhelpful. But equally, it's really there in the Bible as well, so we can't just ignore it. So I think we want to try and get that balance right. Sometimes it can make us uncomfortable as well, because we start thinking about our own sin, and we don't like to think about that. We don't like to kind of dwell on our own sinfulness, and there's a time and a place to do that and to confess. But it can be a tricky one to get the balance right. But it's there in this passage, and it's there as a kind of doorway, isn't it? It was the people's sin that meant that they couldn't enter the holy place in the temple. And it's our sin that means that we can't just wander into God's presence without help. And what we see when Jesus dies on the cross, just going back to Mark 15 again, he cries out those famous words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me? Why have you left me alone? You see, Jesus should have been the very one who was always in the presence of God. He's God's son. He spent eternity past before he came to live on earth in the presence of his Father. And yet in this moment, remarkably, he's the one who's cut off from the presence of God. There's a door that is closed, albeit temporarily, between the Father and the Son. And Jesus isn't in the presence of the Father. And that's what we deserve. We deserve, because of the times when we failed and done things wrong, we deserve to be cut off from the presence of the Father. But Jesus, mercifully and graciously and kindly and generously, takes that upon himself. His death creates an opened door for us. He's cut off from the Father so that we can know both now and forever the joy of being with him. I wonder if the musicians might just like to come up and play gently and lead us in a song in a moment. You know, there's so many reasons why we shouldn't be able to come into God's presence. There's so many reasons why we should be the ones who get cut off. Well, we should have that door slammed in our face. I know I can think back through my own life, and there are so many times when I'm like, God, why are you still going with me? There's so many times I've turned away. I've done things that I know were wrong, and I'm sure you can think of times like that in your life as well. But I love this passage in Revelation. I love that God's promised this open door, that Jesus, through the cross, has made a way for us to come back into relationship with him. And I also love another verse from Revelation 3 that has a door in it. It says this, it says, "Here I am, I stand at the door and knock." I think I've got it on a slide, Craig. That's it, thank you. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person, and they with me. And I love this verse because it's kind of, if you've read like Jesus in the Gospels, that's the stuff he always does. He's always going to find sinners. He's always going to hang out with people who, in theory, shouldn't deserve God's love, who shouldn't deserve the Son of God to come and eat with them and hang out with them. And the people who think they're really holy are always saying, Jesus, what are you doing? Why are you going and hanging out with those guys? You should come and hang out with the really holy people. But that's what Jesus loved to do in his early earthly ministry. And that's what he still loves to do now. He loves to come into the presence of you and me. He loves to knock on the door of our lives. He loves to remind us that there's an open door to walk into his presence, to be close to him, to be friends with him. He's still doing that now. He's inviting sinners to eat with him, to be with him, to live in intimate relationship with him. And if there's anyone here tonight who's not said yes to that invitation, today would be a great day to say yes to Jesus. If you've never said yes, if you never decided that you're going to follow him, if you never decided that you would like to be in relationship with God, tonight would be a great night to do that. And we would love to support you and help you along that journey of what it means to be a Christian. So do come and grab myself or Mike or anyone else at the end of the service if that's you. And you know what? Even if you have said yes to Jesus' invitation, you get to say yes again. We get to say, yes, Jesus, I want to live in relationship with you. I want to live knowing that there's a door that's been opened for me into the presence of the Father. And we've already been enjoying time in God's presence this evening, and we're going to enjoy a bit more time just singing and being together with each other and with him. And one of the ways we're going to enjoy that is by taking communion. We've just set it up by the cross here, and I think during this next song, as we sing and worship, we just like to invite you, just come up. There's no one going to tell you when to come. You can file in neat rows if you'd like to, or just come up whenever. Have some bread and some wine. I think there's gluten-free bread to one side. Come and remember what Jesus has done for us at the cross. Come and remember the way that he's opened the door for us into his presence. And I was just reflecting, we call it communion because we commune with God. We come into community with him, into friendship, closeness, intimacy. And all of that's possible because of the cross. The cross is the way that God has opened the door for us to know him and be with him. So why don't we stand together?